Welcome back to Reviews with Elaine, because I have opinions. And today's opinions will be about Darkwater Daughter by H.M. Long. So this book had so many of the things I love in a story. It had pirates and magic pirates and spirits and twins, and it had really good prose. So that meant I really loved it, right? Right? I'll get to that. So Darkwater Daughter follows Mary, a storm singer. Storm singers are women who can control the weather, storms, snow, and the seas with their voices. But Mary is completely untrained. Her mother always told her to never sing for fear that anyone would notice that she's a storm singer, because if she is found out to be a storm singer, she will either be drafted by the Navy and forced to sing for them, or dragged off to provide fair sailing for pirates. Now she's alone, far from home, having not seen her mother in almost a decade since the woman was herself dragged off to sing for the Navy. Our other lead is Samuel. He is a disgraced naval officer and a sooth. Sooths are magic users who can slip into the other world, the realm of spirits that mirrors the real world. And by doing so, they can have visions and learn about other magic users and stuff like that. But Samuel's power is broken. When he was a child, his mother put him through this ritual that was supposed to enhance his powers, but instead left him unstable and reliant on a talisman to hold him to the physical world. Now a second lieutenant on a pirate hunting ship, he is desperate to recover his good name. Their lives intertwine when Mary is revealed to be a storm singer at possibly one of the worst possible moments. She is chained, gagged, and sold at auction to the highest bidder. Samuel comes across her because he's sent to the auction to buy her as a storm singer, because his ship is sailing off to track down the infamous captain Sylvanus Lear, and they know they'll need a storm singer for this. Too bad Sam's captain is not the only one who is interested in this particular storm singer. Okay, so first of all, I did generally enjoy this book. Like, across the board, I enjoyed the process of reading it. The writing is mostly a little bit more lyrical and poetic than I tend to gravitate towards, but that is never at the expense of its readability. Like, this is not a book I'd suggest you read it while doing other things. Like, it will take most of your attention, but it's not one of those books that I had to stop and reread the same passage over and over again to try to figure out what the hell they were actually saying. And objectively, there's also just no arguing that this book has some really pretty writing. To give you an example, I slipped into my own bones, only to immediately lose grip again. I clung to the divide between worlds, the edge where time had no meaning, and sooths like myself could see the future, the past, and the present. I tried to lurch past it, tried to get free before the visions came, but I was not fast enough. Images assaulted me, fragmented and stark. Mary Firth holding a pistol to a man's head on a dusky road. Charles Grant with a bloodied face, and myself in a summer wold of lording glisten trees. See what I mean? Like, that is not inaccessible. It's not obtuse. You can figure out what the hell it's trying to say pretty easily. But you can also tell that the author did take the time to actually focus on the lyricism and the prettiness and just the joy of the words themselves. I also will say I think the book does a pretty good job of differentiating the different voices in the book, and there are basically three different voices here. There's Mary's, there's Samuel's, and then there is a nebulous third voice. I was thinking of it as sort of the narrative voice of this book, because this is in first-person point of view, as you can tell by the fact that I read a bit for you. Mostly. There are a couple bits that are not, but this is tight held to Mary or Sam's point of view throughout most of the book. But there are a lot of segments in the world building and descriptions and some of the action scenes that don't quite feel like the way they speak. It feels slightly heightened. And this is not a bad thing. It's not one of those things that, like, I'm going, ooh, this just slipped out of the character's voice. No, it just felt a little bit like we were standing beside them getting the description from over their shoulder, which is how I prefer to read books anyway, so maybe that's why I wasn't bothered by this. But also, there's a legitimate reason why sometimes this actually happens in the book. Like, it would be spoiler to tell you what's actually going on, but there are reasons that sometimes a character's voice does not sound like their voice 110%. But that aside, I feel like the differentiation between Mary and Sam's voice is just enough that they felt like they came from the same place. Like, I felt like they were definitely countrymen, but they feel distinctly different enough that I can tell they're different people. This is not one of those books where I'm reading along going, whose point of view am I in right now? I don't know. But there are also segments of the book that are distinctly somebody else's voice, because we have some that are just flashbacks, that it's a nebulous third person, but we also have some that are, like, actual definitions from a end-world reference book explaining to us what's going on, and those sound like the same voice as the nebulous narrator, so to me it gave the book a cohesiveness that I really liked. Now, one thing I did not like about the voices is it's made a big deal of in the book. There are a couple different times where people are making fun of him, poking fun at him, about the fact that Sam speaks in a very stiff and over-educated way, but he didn't sound that distinctly different than anyone else in the book. Like, yeah, he was less likely to drop a cuss word into the conversation, but there aren't that many cuss words in this book. I'm not even sure if there were any. So it just felt a little bit like they were, like, drawing attention to something that wasn't there. Now, they might have been referencing, like, the author may have intended this to be the characters referencing his accent and, like, the actual rhythm of his speech and his tone, and yeah, that could have been what the author meant. But it didn't read like that to me, so instead it just had me standing back going, what are they talking about? But I also really loved the world this book establishes. We're in a world that feels sort of indeterminately fantasy version of the 1700s-ish, which works for me. Like, we've got panniers, the big side hoops, we've got guns, we've also got cutlasses and sailing ships, and this fits our world's real history, because yeah, the golden age of piracy was the 1700s. All of this stuff is stuff you expect to see on a pirate ship. But the world is also just intensely sea-oriented. Like, there doesn't seem to be as much land as there is sea here. And it feels like a very small land. Like, there doesn't seem to be a wide-ranging path outside of what we've seen here. I will say the main character's homeland does feel like analogous to England, but there's also the vibes that some of these other countries are a little bit more inspired by other, like, nations in our world. Like, there's something faintly Eastern about a couple of them, and definitely something faintly African about some of them. And I like this because it just gives us the feeling that this relatively small world that we see is part of a much bigger world that we don't see. But, of course, what I really liked here is the magical stuff. The Gistings, the Other, and how they interplay with the human magic. The Gistings are basically tree spirits that grow from the Other into our world. Like, their roots are in the Other and their body is in our world. And humans harvest the tree to build figureheads, which causes the Gisting spirit, the spirit, to inhabit the ship, which means that the ships are ever so slightly sentient. And I just really liked the way that they interplay with our world, the Other, each other, how much personality they have. They can return to the Other if their ship is burned or destroyed some other way, though it's not really fully implied if they're reborn or just float nebulously in the Other. That might be explained later, and it doesn't bother me that that's not explained. But I just really like the idea overall. It all works for me. And I like the way that it feels connected to, but is not directly explained to be connected to the human magic. And also, I do love the fact that the book does offer those definitions at the front of chapters, because quite often it's explaining the magic system. And I like the way that's done because it gives us all the information we need in a short little segment that doesn't feel like an info dump and doesn't have you wondering why the hell the characters are talking about this thing that they all know, but also it doesn't feel too heavy because they're interspersed throughout the book, and they appear right before we need them, which also allow them to create sort of this vibe of foreshadowing. And so I really loved all that. But that being said, I'm not perfectly happy with this magic system. There's a little bit that feels underdeveloped, and most of it is tied to the human magic. Specifically, both of our leads have magical abilities that they don't have full mastery over, which is pretty normal for a fantasy book. Like, honestly, learning to use your magic abilities is fantasy plotting 101. It appears in like 90% of fantasy books. But I felt like as a reader, I'm still not sure what the training they would need to gain control over their magic would look like. And I should have a vague idea of this. And specifically like Mary, she's never really used her magic before. Like, she's used it once before the book starts. And she's able to call up this giant storm the first time she tries in like a decade, but then she struggles to maintain a steady wind, the kind of steady wind that would be needed to drive a ship. And that bit makes sense to me, because like having pure power but not control is something that does feel like an inborn ability versus a skill that you developed. But then there's this moment where she suddenly is able to control this storm just out of pure more annoyance than necessary need. And like in that moment, she immediately knows that like she has control over the wind, she'll control the waves later, and like she immediately knows that what she was doing wrong before was she was trying to force it rather than asking. And that feels like the kind of breakthrough that often appears in these narratives when the character suddenly realizes how to control the power, and from this point on it will be a steady incline in ability. But we sort of don't get that. Instead, we get going back and forth with her constantly like talking about the fact that she's untrained, other people not letting her do things because she's untrained, referencing don't let people know how untrained she is, but also her like impressing an entire tavern full of pirates with her singing ability and her skills. And like we never actually see her failing at anything. There's a lot of things we see her not trying because she doesn't have the skill set yet to do it, but we don't see her actively failing, which makes it feel less like a lack of ability and more like a lack of trust, which is itself a narrative that works. But I don't think that's what we were going for. And we have almost the exact same problem with Samuel. So Samuel's power is described as broken, and it's directly stated that part of what is broken about his ability is he doesn't have the ability to bring himself back from the other. And specifically, if he goes too deep, he won't be able to return to his physical form, which, considering he's basically in a trance at that point, his body will be sitting there lifeless while he gets ripped to shreds by monsters in the other. But we know the talisman binds him to the world and allows him not to slip in as much, and we know that he does slip in and out without control, but because we never really see a Sooth's power the way it's supposed to work until the end of the book, and even that's only passing moments, I am a reader, as a reader, I'm not sure what bits of this was him being broken and what bits of it were just what a Sooth does. Like, I don't know if Sooths regularly slip in and out of the other and he's just the only one that could get stuck there. I don't know if the fact that monsters come to him more commonly in the other is because he's broken, or if all Sooths drag monsters to them all the damn time. I don't know if all Sooths have the chance of getting trapped in the other, or if it's just him. And we also, like Mary, never see him actively fail. We hear a lot about how he might get trapped, but he's able to bring himself back every time we see him go into the other. And like, there is one moment that it looks like he will get trapped there, but then of course he rises above it. And like, that's a fine narrative, but once again it becomes a narrative less about a power being broken and more about a power just someone not believing in it enough. And I'm fine with that, but that doesn't feel like what the narrative is trying to do. And like, there is a third character that I'm a little bit vague on their abilities here, and what is part of their abilities and what is part of their brokenness, and that's Benedict. But it makes sense for him, because he's not a main character, he's not a POV character, and he's not even really a major character. Also, he's immensely untrustworthy as a character, and he's a terrible person. And I sort of like the fact that I'm, as a reader, not sure if his shittiness is from his broken power, or if that's just who he is. Like, there's the implication that some of it was like he was before, but there's also moments of, like, Sam remembering that Ben would look to him for an idea of how to express emotions even before his power was broken. So, like, I'm not sure if this disconnect from empathy is just he was born without a deep connection to empathy, or if it is from his broken power. And I like that for him because he is a side character and because he is a sometimes antagonist. Like, yeah, he's an important character, he drives a lot of Sam's motives, but he's a side character. And so this confusion feels less like the author did not fully bake the ideas and more like we're seeing it from the outside, and he is someone that we cannot know intrinsically because he is such a distant and possibly evil character. So that all worked for me. And like objectively, there's a lot about this magic system that does really work. A lot that is fully explained, a lot that really gels. There are just a few gaps that are rather noticeable. And I will also say that this is the first book in a duology from what I can tell online. Like there's another book already announced, and I'm guessing that book is going to clarify some of this, but some of the stuff didn't really feel like incomplete plot threads as much as it felt undercooked. I also want to talk about the romance in this book. So this book has a bit of a love triangle-ish, but to my relief, it never fully develops to a full love triangle, and like that's something I'm happy about just because I don't like love triangles. But there are the two hot guys yearning for our female lead. And it's just a bit weird because we spend a good portion of this book sort of, or at least I spent a good portion of this book, unsure who was meant to be love interests and who was just happening to be hot. And part of that is because this is a fantasy book that is set in a sort of pseudo 1700s world with at least some of the prudishness that we expect from an, like, period fantasy. But Mary is super thirsty. Like, she spends a lot of time in this book noticing guys' hands and their thighs and their chests and their brooding eyes and whatnot. And, I mean, I'm all for it. Like, women do feel, you know, sexual urges, at least a good portion of women do, and it's nice to see it expressed outside of the love interest, because most of the time, at least in fantasy novels, when a woman expresses, notices a man's physicality, that is usually a direct signal to the reader that this is going to be the love interest, which does have the sort of weird side effect of implying that all women are only attracted to the man they're destined to end up with. And I sort of like the fact that this book does break that mold, but that did mean when it started to develop into something of a love interest, that it became clear that we are focusing on two guys that Mary is actually vaguely interested in. I was a little bit disappointed with that. And especially considering I don't feel like if you're going to do a love triangle, you sort of gotta do it. And this one doesn't quite do it. Because first of all, one side of the love triangle, it feels a little bit insta-lovey. Like, one side is a guy that she meets and they're immediately oddly drawn towards each other, and like some of that is clearly shown as sexual attraction, like they are physically attracted to each other. But there's also this weird feeling that like, oh, he feels safe around her and she feels safe around him and they're drawn to trust each other. And like, it is such a strong and odd thing. And like, they draw attention to how odd it is. So I really thought what was going on was we were going to get they are magically bound together. Like their powers are somehow interconnected. Or they have a past together that they've half or completely forgotten. Or just there was some form of connection there. And at least in this book, there isn't. It just seems they like each other. And like, there's even a scene that they have together pretty early on in the book where they would have plenty of a chance to get to know each other on a more emotional level, to talk, to express their wants, their needs, their desires, to show real compassion towards each other. But it's kept really short, and almost everything that's in it is described as just like a physical connection. And I was like, why did we not build a relationship there? And like, this is played as if like that was the moment they sort of fell for each other, and like throughout the rest of the book there is sort of that vibe of like, oh, but I must go back to her for this reason. But it wasn't much of anything. And like, this book even manages to work in the miscommunication third act breakup when they haven't seen each other in like 200 pages. And like, that's fine, it's okay, but it just made that side of the relationship feel sort of hollow to me. Like there was a core foundation to the love that was not there. And the other side of the relationship is the one we're clearly intended not to ship. Like, they are the ones that are doomed not to end up together. There's like 2 moments where we're randomly told that this guy has the feels for her, and like 4 or 5 moments where she notices how hot he is. But otherwise, they just come across as friends. And the thing is, they have a lot more time to develop a real relationship. they have that, like, weird enemies to friends to possible something else going on throughout the book that should have felt like it was building romantic tension. And instead, it just felt like they were friends. So when it, in the end, is suddenly like, oh yes, he was in love with me, I was like, was he? I did not notice. And so we have one side of a love triangle that feels really hollow and just forced, and the other hot side of a love triangle that I was going, oh wait, that was there? I didn't notice. So even though I don't like love triangles, somehow this love triangle was not love triangle-y enough for it to work. Overall, I just was a little bit less enthusiastic about the romance in this book than I think the author wanted me to be. But I did absolutely love the characters. Pretty much all of them. I loved how monstrous Lear was. I loved the classic charismatic rogue, and there are several of them in this book. I loved Fisher and her relationship with Sam. Like, it's rare that I find that version of sort of vaguely enemies to allies to friends as a relationship working, and it really did in this one. Like, I got it. I was happy for them to be friends. I vaguely for a moment thought maybe we were intended to ship them, but they work so beautifully as friends that I'm just very happy that that is where we stuck to. Spoilers. But I also loved the fact that Mary was a character who made bad decisions and made decisions that left me going, oh my god, why are you doing that? But they were really consistent. And also, every decision that she made that was bad, it fit with her personality, and I understood exactly why she was making the decision that she made. And the only real failing I saw with the characters in general is the fact that none of the, like, random normal sailors had any character whatsoever. They were all just sailor guy number 1, sailor guy number 2, sailor guy number 3. Oh, that sailor guy has dirty mind. But there wasn't much actual personality to them. But I don't really mind that too much because this is a book that has a really big cast of characters. Like, there are a lot of minor characters that get a lot more characterization to them. So it's fine to have a few really flat characters just as cannon fodder. And especially considering I think the only place that they could have developed more character is from Sam's point of view. And objectively, I do wish there was more in Sam's point of view. Mary gets really 3/4 of the book and he gets maybe a full quarter. And that annoyed me a bit just because I liked Samuel as a character more. Like, he is a lot more the type of character that I really connect to. But adding more to his plot would have just weighted down the book. Like, I will admit there wasn't as much that needed to happen from his side of the story. And also, like, it's very clear to me from the title of the second one that it's going to be significantly more about him. So it seems a little bit silly to complain that he's not enough in this book. Because he is, it's just she gets more time on page. But there's also the ending to talk about. Conceptually, if you were to just sit me down when I was 3/4 of the way through the book and describe this ending to me, A, I'd be mad because that's spoilers, but also I would go, yeah, that sounds great. Like, that sounds perfect. All of our loose ends are going to be tied up. All of our characters get their moment in the sun. We get a dramatic action. We get twists. We get some resolution of the character arcs and a feeling of completeness. That sounds like a good ending. But somehow, while I was reading it, it did not call up the feels and emotions that I wanted it to. I felt like things happened just a little bit fast, and honestly, it felt a little bit like there were too many balls in the air, too many important characters to track, and we didn't really quite have time to settle into any of the feelings. And even the writing itself, most of this book is just a hint on the slower side. Like, not bad slow, just that you're going to need to settle into the sentences kind of slow. And specifically, the story itself is pretty fast-paced, but the prose is descriptive enough that it just keeps the story from feeling rushed. But suddenly, in the climax, a lot of that lyrical language is trimmed back, which is pretty normal for action scenes. But it's trimmed back to a point that it does start to feel a little bit rushed. And so overall, like, the climax of this book, if I was an editor, I would have said just, you know, add about 3 pages to the climax, and that will feel right. And that's not much, considering I think the climax is probably about 15 to 20 pages, so I'm not asking for a huge amount more. It's just we needed just a little bit more time to have feelings in the different moments. Specifically, there's a moment where one of our leads thinks the other may have perished, and it's a lot of big emotions because, of course, by this point they've realized that they're oddly drawn to each other and care deeply. So we need to have moments of them having the feels of like, oh my god, this person that I maybe care about and I don't know why and is really important may be dead, and I need to have feels. But everything moves so quickly in that moment that we don't actually really see any feelings from them. But honestly, a lot of this is me sort of nitpicking because I really liked this book, but I didn't quite love it. And this is one of those books that, like, I had to convince myself to put it down throughout the reading process. Like, I would need to be like, okay, you have to go to bed now, you need to go to sleep, and force myself to put it down. And quite often, this was one of those books that I was like, one more chapter, one more chapter, one more chapter. This is a book that I thought about it when I wasn't reading. This is a book that, like, certain scenes and descriptions from it are going to be popping up in my mind months and maybe even years down the line. Like, it has some beautiful description work. And then I finished it and I just sort of had a feeling of, well, alright, I guess that's it. And most of this review has just been me trying to figure out why I didn't absolutely love this book. But I do want to say I did like this book. I found it very solid, very enjoyable. I'm probably going to buy book 2 when it comes out. I don't think it's out yet. Or if I can afford it when it comes out yet. I'm probably going to buy book 2 at some point, and I definitely will be looking for more books by this author. I like their writing style. But I'm just a little bit less excited about it now that I'm done with it than I was while I was reading it.